Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Sorry, there was a small technical issue there. Welcome back to the session with Simon Lind, who I'm delighted to introduce from Cambridge University Press. He's an international education consultant. And just get his bio here. So Simon has more than 15 years of experience teaching and leading departments at primary and secondary, private and international schools in the United Kingdom and Africa. As senior international education consultant with Cambridge University Press, Simon has worked for over 6 years helping Cambridge international schools around the world, embedding Cambridge resources and active learning strategies into their unique situations, including designing and leading innovative teacher training in Southeast Asia, Pakistan, India, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. So yes, some great experience, and we really enjoyed having Simon speak last year as well in the first edition of this conference. So I would like to now, without further ado, pass over to Simon. So Simon, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation on putting integrated learning at the heart of CLIL.
And good evening or good afternoon, everyone, from me. Thank you very, very much. My bio info is slightly out of date. I've had probably now about 8 or 9 years of doing this rather than just the 6 mentioned, but that's entirely my fault. So hopefully that will work, and I'm hoping that you can all see my screen. So once again, from me, I'm very excited again to be here, and I hope that you will take something away from my fairly fresh look at learning language and putting the integrated learning element at the heart of CLIL. Why I've chosen to do something like this is so often that I find that when I'm working with teachers, listening to teachers, what I find is that so often the content element or the language element of CLIL tend to be emphasized, and we seem to sort of skate over or just assume that we all know about the learning element. And I'd like to take a little fresh look at that, and if by focusing on learning, I think we can master the content and the language element. So in order for us to get going, I'd like us just to join in as much as we can for this. And we're going to do a little bit of assessment for learning. And this assessment for learning is something that I want to run throughout my presentation by asking you to give me feedback, to give me thoughts. I would like to try and make this session as interactive as I can. So for that reason, we're going to do some RAG. RAG is red, amber, green. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And what we could do is, I've got 3 little cards here. You could do something similar. If you're a teacher in schools, every child would have one of these. And red really means I don't understand it. I'm really stuck. So as you're working through a lesson, if a child is indicating red, like today, if you're not sure about what I'm saying, if you want me to repeat something, you type in red or you show red. Amber means I'm okay. So if you're working through a problem, you're doing something with your learners and they're showing amber, it means they're on board, they're on track. And green usually means go, green for go, red means stop, amber means hold on a minute, green for go. But what we want to do today, green means I really understand this and I can tell my colleagues about it. I can share my learning, because ultimately, if you can teach something, you really know it, you understand it. The ability to be able to share your learning is the highest level of learning. And unfortunately, children will often, they will indicate green because they want to please teacher. You might very well indicate green because you just want me to get on with it. But it's an indication that let's move together. So every so often, when you see the traffic light symbol, this traffic light symbol in the triangle, it means I'm going to ask you to let me know how well you have understood a particular section just by typing red, amber, or green into the chat box. So if you'd like to let me know now, do you get that element? Please type into the chat box red, amber, green. And I've just turned up my volume a little bit. I hope that's better. I've made it as loud as I can. My speaker and my volume is high. So everyone's got that. Brilliant. That's lovely. So let's move on. And I'm going to ask you a question that I did ask last year. So if you were here last year, you may be familiar with this. But I want you to think in language terms. What language do you think in? And if you're bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, do you think in both languages? So just let me know in the chat box, generally speaking, what language do you think in? But very crucially, what language do you dream in? So Daphne said both languages. Marie says both. A lot of people are saying both, English and Spanish. So both, definitely English, Portuguese, English and Spanish. But dream in Spanish. The real key here is what do you dream in? Because that's when your mind is switched off. And very often we think mother tongue, yeah, dream mostly in Spanish. That tends to be a language. And the reason for this, reason why I'm asking this, is that language is absolutely integral to the way that we think, the way that we perceive the world around us, the way that we actually get our thoughts, the way we can express it. And if you think about it, mostly Spanish, dream, it depends. I mean, although I have learnt lots of other languages, I tend to focus mainly on my home language, English, and always find words. And Andrea says, sometimes I cannot think of say something in Spanish, but I can always find words in English. And that's absolutely it, because one of the things that we need to focus on is this idea of language and feedback and so on. What language do we think in? But when we are with our students, what language do they think in? They may not be advanced as we are in mastering thoughts and language. I certainly know that when I was teaching in another language many years ago, I did think in that language as well. And this is the way that we have to do it. Now, unfortunately, I don't. I used to be pretty fluent in French. I did have some Spanish, some Italian, some German, some Dutch. And I used to, when I was working in those languages, you could think in them as well. But now it's not so much as well. So mainly dream in English, but have had dreams in Spanish, and tends to be, as Billy's saying, dreams in Spanish, and that's when it's really important. That's a significant event. It's so significant that you're actually dreaming in that. So think about the importance of language. Language is key to assessment and feedback in our schools, in our education system. And often we think about, and we might talk to our students, and they seem to be really switched on. And then we get a test, or we give them a piece of work, and it's really poor. But do we as teachers know, when that student gives us some work that's not great, or a very poor response in class, we ask a question. Now, is it because they don't know the answer? In other words, their content is missing, or is it because they don't have the language skills to answer that? This is a big conundrum, because not always is it as straightforward as that. So we need to think about how we manage this. Now, CLIL is one of these things that has been right at the forefront of multilingual, bilingual education, content and language integrated learning. And in Italy and in Spain and in South America and in most of the Spanish and Latin American countries, it's big. But people don't really understand it. And very often There are misconceptions. What if I make a mistake? I don't want to look stupid. It's not my job to teach language. Do any of these resonate with you? Do some of these statements make sense to you? People say, I can't do it. Grammar scares me. I don't even know what a verb is. And people don't want to engage in CLIL. But is that because they are a little bit unsure about what it means? Okay, Valentina says, yeah, I don't know anything about maths. Maybe. Yes. And Daphne, x2 times and x and xd, absolutely. So what do we know? So let's think about, well, if CLIL is going to be this fairly scary thing, perhaps we need to think about it in a slightly different perspective. Let's just not worry about CLIL as such. Let's think about what happens in our classrooms. Now, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, the reality for most of us is we live in an exam-based system. Exams rule. Whatever level you're at. I mean, I've been into schools where even in grade 1, they have to sit tests, and those tests are really important. And right from grade 1, we've got parents wanting to know, what marks did he get? What's the test result like? And everything focuses on this. And as a consequence, exams tend to be content related. And so many times teachers say, but I haven't got time to do all this active learning. I've got to get through the syllabus. I have to get through the syllabus. In other words, we focus on content. And we think, well, if I've got to get through the syllabus, then we've got to do it. And we've got to memorize it, and we've got to pass exams, and we've got to practice and go over it and go over it and go over it. Because we've got to get that content in. But at Cambridge, we want to think differently. We want to try a different approach. And yes, I do firmly admit that in the good old days, 15, 20 years ago, even as recently as 4 and 5 years ago, many Cambridge exams were very content focused. But for those of us who are very close to the industry, Cambridge International are really changing their exams. They're changing very rapidly. They're introducing a whole new suite of exams, and they're changing the nature of that exam. Skills and application of knowledge are becoming increasingly important. Yes, content is there, but that, and Lillian says, and that's when children start losing the motivation to go to school. Absolutely. So what do we want is we want this idea to look at the red line. And if we look at the red line on that sheet, it's just showing that if we can, and this is the ideal for everyone, we want to move away from this middle, that green peak, teaching to the middle. We know that some children are always going to be at the bottom. We know that some children are always going to be at the top, that very few. But let's shift that peak of achievement to higher achievement with fewer children struggling and more children succeeding. Let's see, we're always going to get that top. But how do we do that? And we can do that by focusing not on memorizing content, but on learning, by thinking about learning, by giving our students the tools to think independently. That's where language comes in. We want them to be able to think independently. We want them to be able to look at an exam question and say, I haven't seen this question before, but I think I've seen something similar. So if I can try something similar, let's see if that works. Let's apply some learning strategies, the thinking and learning strategies. That's right. And Maria said, I believe that children struggle because they feel they need to memorize everything. And at the end, they don't learn because of that. Couldn't agree with you more. So this is what I want to focus on today. This idea that learning has to be at the heart of what we do. Because if we focus on learning, the content and the language are going to take care of themselves. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we progress. So when we think about learning languages or anything else, very traditionally, the so-called traditional view, and we did have someone picking up the grammar there as well, is we learn carefully structured grammar, or we learn content and core vocabulary. So let's learn the grammar. So we open a book and we learn our grammar. And then we practice it and we practice it. That used to be the old-fashioned way. That's the traditional way of learning language. The content, the words in italics relate to content as opposed to language. But it doesn't usually reflect daily language use. So if we're drilling grammar, right, today, children, we are going to learn the past perfect. And so we learn the past perfect. But when do you use it? Do we go out and say, okay, now we're going to have conversations using the past perfect all the time? Or let's learn the present imperfect. Okay, let's go out and do. That's not reality. Do we need to learn language that way? So what we need to think about is learning language by using language. And we call it the communicative approach. In other words, making meaning first. We must communicate meaning first. We must make that meaning. We must use the language. And where that language doesn't quite make sense, then we build in the language support. The grammar comes second. If I can't make myself understood clearly, then I need to learn how to make myself better understood. That's where the learning comes in. And anything else is the same. It reflects daily language use and a multiple subject approach I've put, anything else. If we use that language, if we create that environment where we use language, not just drill it, not just, right, today we are going to learn the past tense. But do we use that? Do we always speak like that? And then we can only, I had this at school when I was visiting a school in Turkey. Oh no, we can't possibly use this book in this class because we haven't learned the past perfect yet. And it's got past perfect in it and we haven't learned it, so we can't use that book. Why not? Do we need to do it that way? So when we think about this, what is it that we need to build up? Well, Professor Coyle, who's incidentally a Cambridge author as well, is one of the leading thinkers about CLIL. And what she's come up with is the 4 C's model of CLIL. She talks about content. She puts content at the beginning, cognition, communication, culture. And under cognition, she has learning, thinking, skills, problem solving. Cognition is brain work. It's what happens in our brain. Communication, and I like this of communication, using languages to learn, learning to use languages. Content in the middle, and culture, intercultural understanding. But I've taken this model and I've looked at it and I've read a lot of her work and I've looked and thought about this and I thought, well, I think we can have a slightly more realistic approach, a less theoretical approach. So this is my 4C model. So I've got this, kept the 4 C's, communication, cognition, culture, and content. And I'll start with communication and I'll take that thing. It's learning to use language and using language to learn. That's why I asked you, what language do you think in? What language do you dream in? Because language is integral to our learning and thinking skills, cognition. You cannot separate thinking and language. You need a language to express your thinking. And the better your language, or the better your command of language, the more able you are to express your thinking. Now, in order for that to work, we need to create a classroom culture where learning and thinking and communicating are much more highly regarded than memorization and drill. Where learning, because learning involves making mistakes, learning involves not always being absolutely perfect. Thinking, sometimes our thinking doesn't work. Maybe we don't quite get it there, but we need this culture that values learning. Not values passing exams, not values memorization, but a culture that values learning. And when we come around to that content, then when we look at that content, we want to be able to articulate it, to communicate our content, to communicate our learning, to remember it, to retain it. All of these are strategies. And to apply it and to think about it, to reflect on it. So let's try and model these ideas. And one of the ways of doing that is, again, to tap into the ideas and the work and just think about this, because this is quite practical, of Professor Jim Cummings. And Jim Cummings works from Ontario University in Canada. And he originally designed what we called the iceberg analogy. That's where the little bit of social language at the top and the big hidden bit of our, what we might call CALP, our cognitive academic language proficiency. But now let's take this a stage further. Bilingual learning means we've got first language and we've got second language. But if we focus on the learning of that, then we can develop this common underlying proficiency, a so-called central operating system. Sounds very much like a computer, doesn't it? Okay, this common underlying proficiency where we're teaching strategies, learning strategies that can work across languages. So if this makes sense to you, if what I've been talking about, please let me know. Red, amber, green. Language is vital for learning. We need to move from the focus of content and memorization and build a bilingual learning culture based on understanding, developing thinking skills. So please, in the chat, type in red, amber, green, please, if that makes sense to you. So red if it makes no sense, amber or green if it tends to make a little bit of sense to you. Billy's quick off the mark with green. Have we lost a lot of people? Our chat. Only one's showing green. No one's filling in the chat then. Thanks, Billy. That's the one that's got green. I'm just looking to see if I'm still there. Oh, have I lost everyone? Seems like I've got no response from the chat. Anyway, if that's the case, I'll just carry on. Billy, are you the only one there by any chance? Scott, have we?
I think I can still hear you fine and see you fine. I think everything's okay.
Yeah, I'm just concerned. I've only had one response in the chat, so
it must be a problem with your chat, because I can see lots of things coming through the chat.
They are now coming through. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now they're suddenly starting to come through, and it seems like there was a bit of a problem with the chat. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. It's great. Thanks, Scott. It's coming through. Perfect. Absolutely. Probably too many people coming through at once, maybe. So if we're happy with that, amber and green, that's brilliant. Yes, amber is perfect because I understand you'll need to think about all of this just a little bit. Anyway, amber, brilliant. Okay, so let's focus on learning. Let's think about what do we mean by learning. So I want to take us and look at what we call the active learning cycle. Now, learning is not fixed, and learning is a continuous process. We learn from all sorts of sources. Learning cannot be constrained. We can't limit learning. And unfortunately, many of our schools do limit learning because they insist on teachers writing a lesson plan for every lesson and sticking to it. But I'm afraid learning doesn't follow a plan. Having a fixed lesson plan and having to stick to that doesn't take into account the assessment for learning, the variables in the class, the responses. So we like to think about our learning to be a learning cycle. And it starts with planning. Planning has to be at the heart, but you have to plan for learning, not writing lesson plans, planning for learning. That means we plan some learning intentions. We plan success criteria. Learning intention, what we want our learners to learn. Success criteria, how we know they are learning. It's the steps. Then we plan our learning activities. What are we actually going to do to drive this learning? And then in big and red and bold with large type, we give continuous feedback. And based on that feedback, like this, red, amber, green. What happens if you're doing a lesson, and as you're doing a lesson, most of your children start showing red? But your lesson plan says in 5 minutes, I've got to stop this activity and do the next one. But all of the children haven't got that activity. They haven't understood it. This is where we need flexibility in planning. So we review, we reflect, we plan again, and it becomes a learning cycle. Okay, so it needs to respond to what is actually happening in the classroom. And what is happening in the classroom, quite simply, John Holt said in 1964 in a book that he wrote called How Children Fail, and this is a long time ago. He was working in America. He used to get thrown out of schools on a regular basis because he challenged the way things happened in school. He felt that school destroyed children's creativity, destroyed their curiosity. And he said, learning is not the product of teaching. In other words, the teacher who stands up in front and talks at the children. I taught in a school once where actually the teacher stood on a dais. So you were raised above the classroom. You were not supposed to come down. You lectured your students in front of you. Learning is the product of the activity of learners. And activity of learning involves using language, because language is key to thinking. Language is key to expressing. Language is key to looking and reading and so on. We have to integrate language. So what we need to do is we need to think about planning for learning. And when we plan for learning, we start off with a learning intention. And our learning intention is, what are we going to learn? Preferably a skill. You'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. So for example, today we might be writing a story. Maybe it's a ghost story. But what actually we're learning to do is we are learning to write a suspense story. We're learning to structure it. We're learning to build up the suspense, the story mountain, building it to a climax and resolving it towards the end. Okay, what are we going to learn? Not what are we going to do, what are we going to learn? Okay, not what we're going to do. That's why I don't like learning objectives, because a learning objective is, what am I going to teach you? Or what am I going to tell you? A learning intention says, what are we going to learn? Success criteria is how we know we're making progress. It's the steps to success. It's how we evolve. And good success criteria are made or stated as can statements. Learners can do this. I can do that. So it's the steps. In other words, if we're writing a story, I can introduce the story. I can build up suspense. I can do this. And that means that when you come to giving feedback or assessment, you can recognize the progress and you give guidance on the next steps based on the success criteria. So what I'm talking about in this case is a doing activity. We call it from doing to learning. What are we doing? Well, we might write a ghost story, but actually we are learning to use a story mountain, set the scene, build it up to a climax, and finish it off. We might be doing art. We're painting a sunset, but what are we doing? Painting a sunset. What are we learning? How to blend colors. Because if we're learning how to blend colors, we could paint a sunset, we could paint a sunrise, we could paint a sea scene, we could paint clouds, we could paint water. Those are different doing activities to support the learning activity. We might play a maths game, play the complements to 20 dominoes game. That's a maths game where you have to have how many dominoes, and whoever puts the next one in, the first to 20 wins. What are we learning? Choosing appropriate strategies to carry out calculations involving addition. We're having to think carefully. In science, we might mix salt and water and see what happens. We'll mix flour and water. That's what we're doing. But what we're actually learning is to understand and explain the difference between solutions and mixtures. So when we think about this, we have to plan for learning, because learning involves language. We've already said that. So in Cambridge books, this is the way that our Cambridge books are now structured. Learning intentions, success criteria, lots of guidance for the teachers. And just here, learning objectives, these come from the curriculum framework, but in the books we have learning intentions and success criteria. Learners can ask questions to find out general information. If they can't, then we know we haven't reached that stage. We need to put in a bit more practice. That's why it's called success criteria. Can they or can't they? Now, a learner-centered approach means that when we do this, we need to focus on our learners. And a good practice is to discuss with your class what they're going to learn. Don't tell them, discuss with them, share with them, let them ask, what are we going to do? Involve them. How will they learn best? What language or vocabulary will they need? And don't go to the board and write down objective today and then spend the next 10 minutes copying down the learning objective, because that's handwriting practice. No one's learning anything. That's just handwriting practice. You write up on the board, they copy it down. You don't discuss it. Children sit in silence, practicing their handwriting. No one's learning anything. A far better way to do it is to get into this routine of having talk partners. So at the beginning of a lesson, learners will review the previous lesson with a partner. They'll talk about something new they learned last lesson, what they found easy, what they found difficult, and what they would like to learn next. In other words, we're leading up to a discussion of the learning intention. But this is a language-rich exercise. You're giving them the vocabulary because they've learned something from the last lesson. It's peer discussion. You have got multiple language interactions happening in the class, and they are for a specific purpose, and they are guided because they know they're going to talk about something new that they've learned. They can share about it. They might find that each took something different from that lesson. Again, what do they find easy? They might have found different elements easy, different elements difficult. What will we learn next? And if you get this routine going, teachers often say to me, one of the biggest challenges in bilingual education is that the children are quite willing to talk to teacher in English in their languages, in their language lessons, because they know they're learning English and that's what the lesson is all about. But they don't want to talk English to their friends because they always talk Spanish to their friends and they don't want to talk English. But they don't really know how to do it and it feels uncomfortable. But if you get them into this routine of at the beginning of a lesson, they're going to talk to their friends in English and they know what they're going to talk about. It's not social chat. It's specific guidance. They're using their key vocabulary. They are building up their language skills. If they can't understand each other, they are going to have to find a way to make their friends understand. This is called using language. You don't have to formally teach a grammatical structure. Today, when we do our learner-centered approach and when we do our talk partners, you must talk in the present tense. And I will expect to hear 3 phrases from the past imperfect as well. That doesn't work. Okay, that doesn't work. So we use language to communicate. If they can't understand each other, then they have got to find a solution. It's called a learning skill. This is what we need to think about. We've got to focus on these ideas. When it comes to continuing the lesson, plan your keywords and phrases and pre-teach them. Okay, make sure they have the tools to access the text. Make sure they have the tools to engage in discussion. Read your teacher resources. Read your books, identify words that they might struggle with, and then pre-teach them. And it's very easy just to pre-teach some key words so that when the children come across them, and this happens for older learners as well, you can take this all the way up to grade 12, grade 10, same strategy. The words might be longer and more complex and maybe more subject specific, but the function is the same. You are enabling them to access the text. You are giving them the tools to allow discussion. They're not having to try and find words. Remember the slide I said right at the beginning? Do we know if we ask a question that they don't understand it or they don't have the language skills? And if you combine it with some instant feedback, you know what's happening in your classroom. You know then that you might have to change something. And this is why I say, give learners as much help as you can. Put vocabulary sheets up in the classroom. Make sure they can see them all the time. Consider doing open book tests and exams where they can refer to text, make notes. It's not cheating, it's learning. It's giving them strategies to cope, and it's building language skills. So here's an example. Okay, this is just an example. We're going to learn some mathematics and we're going to learn mode and median. 2 words in English that, oh, okay, well, how am I going to teach that? Well, in the teacher resource, a wonderful suggestion. We have a language support idea, and it says use memory activities to support learners. Median sounds like medium. Medium is the middle. So the median is the middle value. So there's a learning strategy, and that is a learning strategy. Mode sounds like most. So make the connection between mode and the most common. It's a learning strategy. It's a language learning strategy. You're learning content, but you don't have to worry about, oh, it's the grammar, it's this, that. It's a strategy. It's teaching children to think, okay? It's teaching teachers to think. So when we're talking about all of these, okay, think about our planning. So once again, please let me know, there's our traffic light. Hopefully our chat will work now. When we talk about planning, we talk about planning for learning. Learning is a continuous process. Don't worry about the lesson plans. Learning intentions, success criteria, and feedback are directly linked, and lessons begin with talk partners. So does this make sense? I know it's a lot to take in, and brilliant. Thank you again, Amber. It's brilliant. It is challenging. I know it's challenging because it's what I'm doing is trying to paint a slightly alternative picture. It's moving away from the constraints. And now for this next part, I hope, not too long to go, so I hope I'm not boring you, not too long to go, but to make this work, okay? If we want this to work, then we need to have a particular strategy. And that strategy is to know your learners. This comes from, I've taken this from my webinar and work on differentiation. And a key element of differentiation is to know your learners. And the reason why I say you need to know your learners is so that you can give them feedback appropriate to their level of language and understanding. So find out, get to know, who are their friends? If you're doing group work, do you just put them together in a group? Or do you know who works together, who doesn't? Do you know who are friends in the class, who their friends are? Do you know that, oh, those two, you've just put them into a group, but they hate each other's guts and their parents are always fighting? Do you know that? So talk to them, listen to them. How do they use language? What's their vocabulary like? So get to know your learners. That's a really key strategy, because then you can give feedback appropriate. You can also do questioning at their level. So I suggest that you actually get to know them, keep a learner profile, keep it updated. There's just a little example up there. What's their favorite subject? What their worst subject? What they think they're good at? And for younger learners, what might be really interesting is to ask them what they think and ask their parents. Have they actually got the same ideas? How well do their parents know their children? So think about that. And the reason why, okay, because to know your learners, does the learning activity that you're planning require specific behavior from the learners? Do you know who works? Do you know if they can do it? Have they had any experience before? Does it require them to work together in groups or pairs? Do you just assign pairs? Do you let them choose who works together? Are friendship pairs always the best? Have you assigned roles? So do you know who is strong at language? How well do they use language? Okay, so know your learners. It's really key to understanding them, because then your feedback, your knowledge of them is coming together. So just very briefly on that one, please let me know, does that make sense to you? I'm sure you already do know your learners, but I just want to know. So know them. How well do they use language? Do they have good support at home, especially for remote teaching? Who do they work well with? What is their personality like? Okay, it makes a difference to all of these. And thank you for the greens. It seems that this section makes a little bit of sense to most people. So that's most encouraging. Brilliant. Okay, just to finish off with, let's see again if we can put some of these ideas into practice. So what might our classrooms look like if we try and put these together? So once again, I'm going to ask you to think about, firstly, what language interactions, what interactions in general happen in your classroom. Most classrooms that I go into, when I watch teachers and learners, especially when they're doing language exercises, very often the only interaction is teacher to learner. Teacher asks a student, a learner, a question, learner responds. It's one-on-one. It does go quite quickly, but it's only ever one-on-one. What is the rest of the class doing? When you're asking, and you ask a student a question, and that student is struggling to find an answer, and you can see around you, all the hands suddenly go up and everyone's there, they're waving, they want to answer, and you're focusing on one student. What learning is happening? What are the rest actually learning? What are they doing? So think, when we're doing it, try and do more pair work, guided discussions in pairs, because you divide your class of 20 into pairs, then they are all discussing together. It's not just one-on-one. And then as teacher, you can listen to the pairs. You set them an exercise. I know you do all of these anyway, but just be aware. Think about the interactions that are happening. And one of the ways of doing it, oh, by the way, When I talk about group work, again, group work, I've often gone into classrooms and I've watched children working, and the teacher says, now we're going to do some group work. But actually what I see is individuals or children sitting around tables working as individuals. That's not group work. Group work is very specific. So 3 things that I want you to think about, and these are all linked to language skills: questioning, scaffolding, and feedback. 3 key strategies. But for this really to work, you need to know your students. You need to know your learners. You need to understand them. Because if we're going to use questioning effectively, then we need to think about open questions. Let's say, for example, in our classroom, we know that we've got 2 or 3 children whose, for whatever reason, their language levels are a little bit lower than we would like. They're quite clever, but their language levels are lower. So when we ask them a question, perhaps ask them a question appropriate to their language levels. Maybe a slightly more closed question that requires a shorter answer. You're still getting them to use their language, but you know that there are other children in the class who have better language levels. So don't give a response to those children, to that child. You've asked them a question perhaps, then just say, okay, to the next child, you've heard that. What do you think about that? Can you comment on that answer? Appropriate to their language levels, you're building up the questioning strategy all the time. This one that I've given you here, pose, pause, pounce, and bounce. This is very familiar to many of us. Pose is ask a question. Pause, give the class thinking time, and in a bilingual situation, it's also translation time, because our learners may not have all the language thinking skills. They may need to translate into their home language, think of an answer, translate it back into English. Give them time to do that. And then choose a learner. Don't let them put their hands up. You select who's ever going to ask that question. Then they've all got to think. Don't let them decide who's going to answer it. You decide. And the best way to do that is to have random things. You pull out a random name. Okay, you've got names written on pieces of coffee stirrers, the names of your learners. And then they know that it could be them. They all have to think of an answer. And then the most challenging of that is don't give a response. Bounce the question. Let them think further. Keep them thinking. Okay, you've really got to keep them thinking about it all the time. And this is where Bloom's taxonomy comes in, because if you know your learners and their language levels, you can ask your usual fairly simple questions, understand and remember. Some you can ask, analyze and apply, and right at the top, think about your creativity and your evaluative questions. So think about the types of question you use. The higher up you go, okay, generally speaking, the higher up you go, the more complex the language requirements become. And that's what you want to do. You want to develop language and thinking skills. So don't stick to the short, simple, closed questions. Ask open-ended questions, because then they have to use language. If you just ask one-word answers and short, simple ones, they're not using the language. But if you're asking them to apply and analyze and evaluate, they have to use their language skills. And this is what it's all about. It's developing those language skills. You don't have to worry about the grammar, whether they make mistakes or not. Remember what I said right at the beginning of our 4 C's, the C, the culture, the classroom culture, where they don't have to be perfect. As long as they are communicating with understanding, that is enough. Then we can develop the communication skills for that. Scaffolding, same kind of thing. scaffold your content, your language, and your learning. So in writing, as you might see there on the page, in that writing here, there is a way of scaffolding a writing. Paragraph 1, paragraph 2, it's got all the hints that you do. That's scaffolding. And you can vary the scaffolding. Some children will need more, some children will need less. Okay, so written and verbally. And verbally is probably the best way of scaffolding. And when we talk about that, if we're prompting them, say things like, tell me a little bit more about this, or what do you think he means? So remember when we talk about bouncing questions? He's given me an answer. I'm not quite sure. Well, Johnny, you've just heard what Jimmy said. Tell me more about that. Ah, okay, Laura, you've heard what Jimmy and Johnny have said. What do you think they mean? That's prompting. That's getting them to think, articulate, and use their language. You can model answers. So if I asked, what color is the, let's say, what color is the moon tonight? Then the answer I would like would be something like, it is dimly shining through the sun, the clouds. So you can give model answers or give sentence stems. And sentence stems is particularly useful if you're doing scientific work or mathematical work. So, what is 2 plus 2? 2 plus 2 is. So you use the beginning of the question as a sentence stem. So there's lots of things that we can think about when it comes to scaffolding. Use flashcards, use placemats, use visuals, all sorts of things. And when it comes to bilingual, and I'm all in favor of bilingual, teaching in both languages, don't just translate. Ask them to think about different ways of finding meaning. We talked a lot about that last year as well. And another way of thinking about it is use prompt cards. Give them discussion topics on cards. So what can you see in the foreground? What can you see in the background? They're fairly open questions. Okay, they think, what can you see? What do plants give off and how do you know? So design cards. They can sit there and they can discuss them in groups. And what you're doing there is you're giving them the key words, the vocabulary, the structure to discuss. So you're making it work for them. You're developing their language skills and their content skills and their thinking skills. Okay, so it works all around. When you're giving feedback, once again, feedback is personal. You have to link it to the success criteria. You have to link it to your knowledge of your learners. So personal, related to your knowledge. Give a positive message and guidance on how to improve. So think about it. And by the way, when we talk about written feedback, and a big challenge, and this again comes from another one of my webinars that I've talked about, and this works from the work of Black and William, Dylan William and Paul Black, who produced a book called Outside the Black Box, and comment only marking, because Dylan William makes the statement there that the moment you give a mark or a grade, learning stops. So think about that. The moment you give them a mark, they're only interested in the mark. Their parents are interested in the mark. But if you don't give them marks, if you give them comments that they have to action, focusing on how to improve, you can write a mark in your mark book, but don't share the marks all the time. Challenging that, I know. So 2 minutes, oh, right, I better get on with it. So here's an example of how we give good written feedback. So 2 minutes, oh dear, right, I better get on with it. So immersive learning is the next stage. I'll just finish off because I actually am finished, but I'll skip this and go straight on to the last few thoughts. End your lessons as you start them. Give an exit ticket. What have I learned? What have I found easy? What have I found difficult? Because that will lead into your next lessons pair discussion at the beginning. Think about using the exit tickets. It's focusing on learning. develop this idea of the growth mindset. Look at the work of Carol Dweck. Think about that. And finally, and this is finally, always ask yourself, who is doing the work? If you're standing up in front of them and you are talking and you're waving your arms and you're writing on the board and you are doing this and you're telling them what to think and you're answering their questions, who is doing the work? As we say, all too often, students come to school to watch their teachers work. Students come to school to watch their teachers work. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Simon. Yeah, so again, just to yes, reiterate the invitation for questions, and thank you, Simon, for that. So I think it was incredibly generous with the information and the content there that you're giving everyone. Really, really fascinating. Thank you very much. So yes, are there any questions, please, for Simon? There's one. So I have a question on scaffolding activities. How can we use them, for example, when improving listening?
Okay, when we're talking about improving listening and we want to scaffold a listening activity, then one of the ways of doing that is that if we're doing a listening activity or a speaking activity, anything of that nature, if you give them, if you like, fairly clear cards with certain words on them. So you're giving them this prompt. They can listen for the words, and if they can recognize. So what we're doing here is we're giving them different options. You're doing a listening exercise, but very often listening exercises, there are no other cues for the learners to interpret the words. So if you either use pictures or words on cards, when you're doing a listening activity, you are giving them additional cues or clues as to the words that they should be hearing, because they might recognize them in print, they might be able to see them in a picture. So this is the way that we can scaffold listening activities as well. You can also scaffold by modeling an answer for them. So you might want to say, well, if I'm asking this question, then this is the kind of answer, these are the kind of words that you should be listening for, and you can say a few key words ahead of time. So you're scaffolding their listening activities. So does that make sense to you? Thank you, Constable. Yes.
Thank you, Simon. I think we have time for one more question, which is, are there any suggestions about where to find more information or insights on effective feedback? So any suggestions of authors?
Okay, yes. One of the most notable areas on this and effective feedback is, I referred to it very briefly. You can look at the work of Black and William, who operate out of the University of London. And there is also the work of English. I shall get back to you. I know her name. I've got her book. Marion, can't remember offhand, but she's done a lot of work. I'll try and find out and get that information across to you. So sorry about not being able to remember that, but yeah. So Carolina's got a lovely comment. I learned a lot today. Remember how important it is to know my students and make them participate more actively. And I think, to me, that's the key, that if you can actually know your students, understand their language, their background, they will be much more willing to involve themselves in the learning, because they feel valued, because they know that you know something about them. And you know, this personal idea is really very useful. Right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Simon. I think we'll give you a break now. But once again, thank you. I mean, that was fascinating, and I think you may not have had chance to see them all, but I mean, great comments coming through, and thanks for I think such a complete presentation. And as I say, I think very generous in the material you've given there. So thank you very much for that. Thank you everyone again for joining. And I would like to remind you all that again, there are the breakout rooms. So for Neuroeduca and Cambridge University Press. So at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom menu, you can see there is an icon for breakout rooms. So you can jump into those if you would like to go and meet the representatives from those organizations. So I'm going to, we'll finish here, but thank you very much again, Simon, and thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you're having an enjoyable afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.